Moving into chapter 21, we are now ready to begin our first looks at some specific diseases. We're going to start with diseases that affect the skin and the eye. As you learn the different diseases, it is important to keep up with, number one, what type of microbe is causing the infection. Bacterial, protozoan, fungal, helminth, viral, whichever of those classifications is the first thing you got to make sure you're keeping up with. After that, for each disease, you need to make sure you understand the microbe name that's causing the disease, the etiology, the characteristic signs and symptoms, and then if we discuss it, you need to make sure you understand how that particular infection is going to be treated. All right, so if we're going to talk about the skin and the eyes, we need to look a little bit at the anatomy of these two regions. So with the skin is really designed to keep pathogens out. The skin has multiple layers. This outer layer of the epidermis is covered by a layer called the stratum corneum. It's very rich in keratin. It has little linking cells that really prevent anything from getting past that layer. You also do something called desquamation of the skin, which means your outer skin layers kind of slough and shed and peel off at a constant rate. So if you do have microbes on your skin, if you just kind of wait long enough, they're going to peel and come off. Your skin is going to have sweat glands so that you're constantly producing sweat, liquid to wash things off. You're going to produce sebum or oil from your sebaceous glands, which is going to provide kind of an inhospitable environment for a lot of microbes. One of the most important things that your skin has going for it is a very broad group of normal microbiota that live on the skin. They keep the skin from being invaded by pathogenic microbes. Different types of bacteria and fungus live in different areas. The beta proteobacteria are really common in the dry areas of your skin. The propionibacteria are very common in your sebaceous, oily areas. The Corynebacterium and Staphylococcus live in the more moist areas of your skin. And then Malaysia is a fungus that's commonly found on the skin. Now, all of these are good bacteria and fungi, but you can get an infection of these normal microbes on your skin. The easy way to think about this is what happens if one of these normal bacteria moves into a deeper layer of the skin than where it's really supposed to be. And then we get things like pimples, cysts, common issues that all of us are familiar with. So if you've ever heard of someone having an abscess is just a localized area of pus. Pus is a collection of dead white blood cells. If you have a collection of white blood cells, well, that means you've most likely had something that your immune system has killed. Most of you have heard of a carbuncle, a cyst, folliculitis, boil. So I highly recommend that you look through these words. The next picture also gives you something a little bit more characteristic to help you keep up with the different types of lesions you may see on the skin. Now, there are times when these opportunistic infections can get really bad. An example of that would be a MRSA infection. Some of your normal microbes are antibiotic resistant. So a lot of people that work in healthcare systems or have had long hospital stays may have some of these really dangerous bacteria living as normal residents on their skin. I actually tested positive for MRSA on the inside of my nose. I went in to have a procedure and they required that I had my nose tested. I had absolutely no idea I was harboring this bacteria. I had never had any sort of negative infection or reaction at all, but I had to use an antibiotic cream in my nose or they wouldn't let me in the hospital simply because they were trying to control this bacterial infection. All right, well, what about the eye? Well, with the eye, you have your nasolacrimal drainage system, which is kind of a fancy way of saying that you're constantly able to flush with liquid, removing things from your eye. You also have lysozyme and mucins that keep bacteria from growing. But you, again, have a very healthy, normal microbiota. On the outside layers of the eye, the mucous membrane called the conjunctiva, you have lots of microbes that keep things from growing. But if some of those residents overgrow or you get microbes in your eye that aren't supposed to be there, you can end up with conjunctivitis, which is inflammation of the eye. I know you've all heard of pink eye. You can end up with keratitis, which is an inflammation of the cornea, or you can have a combination of the two. And any overgrowth of bacteria or virus in your eye is going to lead to one of these conditions. Now that you understand that the skin and the eyes are heavily protected by that normal microbiota, let's look at some more specific infections that can occur on these two areas. So what about Staphylococcal infections? Well, staph is a normal microbiota. Staphylococcus aureus can be non-pathogenic and cannot hurt you. But if you get some sort of infection because you have a break in the skin or that staph moves to an area it's not supposed to be, then you can get some pretty nasty side effects. Staphylococcus is a bacteria that is known to be coagulase positive. So this leads to coagulation of blood plasma, and you end up with clumping in the area, which causes collections of white blood cells, pus, things like that. So what are some specific staphylococcal infections? Well, the most common would be something like folliculitis. Folliculitis is going to be an itchy red pus-filled bump, and a lot of times what we consider a pimple. That is when the staph that's normally on your skin moves into the deeper layers, like down in a hair follicle or something like that. Folliculitis can lead to a boil, which is a deeper infection, and then multiple boils can lead to a carbuncle that would require draining. That's going to be this picture here. Infants sometimes end up with staphylococcal scald skin syndrome, which is shown in this picture here. It's an excessive sloughing of the skin. The desquamation kind of gets out of control, and the outer layers of the skin will actually remove themselves. Impetigo is a common staph infection in children where you get these characteristic yellow crusty vesicles around the nose and the mouth. Very, very contagious, spread real fast amongst children. So those are some example staph infections. Now let's look at some strep infections. Streptococcus pyogenes is a common microbe, but it can cause some really bad infections because it's able to produce something called the M protein. This is a protein that really enhances the transmission of the microbe and makes a pretty nasty immune response. This is one of the #1 bacteria that causes cellulitis. That's these pictures at the top. Cellulitis is an inflammation of the deeper layers of the skin. Very, very painful. And if any of you have ever heard of flesh-eating bacteria or necrotizing fasciitis, that is typically an infection of Streptococcus, although sometimes Staphylococcus, where we get a really rapidly growing infection that leads to tissue death, where the infection is actually so deep it's between the skin and the muscle itself. The only way to really treat this necrotizing fasciitis is to remove the skin that is infected. So something probably a little less disturbing, let's talk about some ear infections. Pseudomonas is the most common bacteria that causes swimmer's ear. You can also get a Pseudomonas infection from a swimming pool or a hot tub that appears just as a red rash on the skin. So you can see that in either picture. Pseudomonas is also commonly found as an opportunistic infection in burn victims. Our next issue to look at is acne. Acne is most commonly associated with hormonal changes that we see as someone begins to overproduce oil on the skin. So what typically happens is as the skin tries to shed its outside layers, the oil gets trapped down in a pore. Now, when that oil gets trapped down in a pore and gets covered by skin, you get what we call a whitehead. And then the stuff you're pushing out of that whitehead is typically a collection of pus, white blood cells. When you get a blackhead, that's just going to be when the skin doesn't completely cover that infection of the normal bacteria getting down in the pore, and so it oxidizes and it becomes darker colored. A clogged hair follicle is usually the site where you're going to see this infection occurring. So let's look at conjunctivitis caused by specific bacteria. Some of the most common bacteria that lead to conjunctivitis would be Haemophilus influenza, Streptococcus pneumoniae, Staphylococcus aureus, but there can be lots of them, lots of causes. There is years ago, there used to be a very serious problem with neonatal conjunctivitis caused by Neisseria gonorrhea and Chlamydia trachomatis. These are sexually transmitted diseases that the babies were coming in contact with as they came through the mother's birth canal. We now, the moment an infant is born, treat the eyes with an antibacterial cream to prevent any sort of neonatal conjunctivitis. So let's talk about a really serious disease of the eyes. This is caused by a bacteria, Chlamydia trachomatis. This bacteria is the #1 cause of preventable blindness in the world. In certain parts of the country, people are infected by this bacteria. It's spread by flies, and the flies will land all over the body, but if the fly lands near the eye and the person gets a bacterial infection of this specific bacteria in the eye, it can cause eyelid scarring and ultimately inversion of the lid, and then people will lose their vision. This video here I'm not going to play as I lecture, but I highly recommend you go back and watch this video. It gives you some really interesting information about the disease. Alright, so let's talk about viruses now. Let's move away from bacteria. Viral infections of the skin are very common. One of the most common is an infection of the virus called human papillomavirus, or HPV. It causes warts. There are many different types of warts, and warts are simply caused by direct contact with the virus. Warts are generally harmless. They're overgrowth of your normal skin tissue. Another viral infection that affects the skin is the herpes simplex virus. Herpes simplex type 1 is transmitted by oral contact, and it causes cold sores. This is very different from herpes simplex type 2, that's known as genital herpes, as well as some other STDs that are in the herpes family we'll go over. Cold sores are a latent infection, meaning you may keep the herpes simplex virus type 1 in your body at all times. You never get rid of it. But just every now and then when your body is stressed by exposure to sunlight or anything like that, you can see a reoccurring outbreak of that cold sore. All right, a couple more viral infections. We have Roseola and fifth disease. These diseases are very similar. They're both spread by direct contact, although fifth disease is much more commonly associated with respiratory secretions. With both of these rashes, they're going to start with a cold-like symptom and then end up with rash all over the body. One of the easiest ways to separate the two is this characteristic slapped cheek syndrome with fifth disease, where the baby has almost a solid red cheek. All right. So not just bacterial and viral infections, we need to look at fungal infections of the skin. Very common fungal infection is in this genus Tinea. Tinea is a fungus that causes infections all over the body. The type of tinea is going to determine which area of the infection is going to be found. These particular types of infections are what we call ringworms. Ringworms are not worms. Tinea corporis and Tinea capitis are fungal infections of the body and scalp. Something we call athlete's foot and jock itch are also Tineas, the same type of and same group of fungus that causes ringworm. There is nothing deadly about these type of fungal infections. They're just going to be kind of a headache, kind of a hassle. They just need to be treated. And then our last fungal infection that affects the skin is a yeast infection. Yeast infections can appear as itchy to painful rashes all over the body. You can see yeast infections under the skin, and you can also see these type of candida yeast infections in the genital regions. So we'll talk about those a little bit more when we get to diseases of the genitourinary system. Again, as you learn the diseases, classification, bacterial, viral, fungal, which of those is it? Name of the microbe causing the disease, characteristic signs and symptoms of the disease.